Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. If you asked me what I remember most about my graduation day, it wouldn't be the applause echoing through the university auditorium, or the weight of the degree I had spent 4 exhausting years earning. It would be the smell of damp wool and wet asphalt inside a sterile civic registry office on the edge of the city. I sat in a plastic chair, my black graduation gown pooled around my ankles, watching my father pace the narrow corridor. Arthur Vance was a man made of nervous energy and reckless desperation, his hands trembling as he checked his watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes. He did not look it. He couldn't. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My mother had passed 2 years ago, leaving nothing but hospital bills that Arthur had tried to fix with ruinous loans, digging a pit so deep it threatened to swallow my entire future. And then, the door opened, and the man who held the deed to my life walked in. Julian Sterling brought the winter inside with him. He was not a man who entered a room so much as he altered its atmospheric pressure. An older, stoic CEO of a green energy empire. He wore a heavy charcoal overcoat that smelled faintly of cedarwood and cold rain. He did not possess the frantic, sweating ambition of the men my father usually dealt with. Instead, the executive carried a quiet, unyielding stillness, like a cliff face enduring a storm. He walked past Arthur without a word, his gaze fixed entirely on the magistrate's desk, where the marriage contract lay waiting. This was the transaction. The massive financial debts hanging over my family would be completely cleared, absorbed into the vast, invisible ledger of his corporate empire, and in exchange I would become his legal wife. There were no vows written on parchment. There were no flowers, no soft lighting, no music. Not a celebration, but a settlement. I stood up, the synthetic fabric of my graduation gown, rustling loudly in the quiet room. The tall man finally turned to look at me. His eyes were a pale, striking gray, observant and entirely unreadable. He did not look at me with pity, nor did he look at me with the predatory ownership I had spent weeks dreading. He simply offered me the silver fountain pen. My fingers brushed the cold metal as I took it from his hand. I did not hesitate. I signed my name, Clara Vance, on the dotted line, feeling the ink bleed into the heavy fiber of the paper. With that single stroke, my father's catastrophic mistakes were erased, and my independence was surrendered. Arthur let out a ragged, audible breath of relief, stepping forward as if to embrace me, but I turned my shoulder just enough to stop him. I did not want his apologies. I did not want his tears. My new husband watched this silent rejection, his expression remaining perfectly blank. Though I thought I saw a microscopic tightening in his jaw, the drive to coastal New England was a blur of gray skies and violent rain lashing against the tinted glass of the luxury sedan. I sat in the back seat, staring out at the blurred shapes of pine trees, analyzing the terrifying void of my new reality. The vehicle smelled of rich leather and the faint, clean scent of peppermint, a stark contrast to the stale cigarette smoke that always clung to Arthur's worn car. Julian sat beside me, reading through a stack of quarterly reports, his silence heavy and absolute. He did not attempt small talk. He did not try to reassure me. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling entirely unmoored, holding onto my dignity like a fragile shield. I was expecting a prison. I was expecting the sterile, suffocating demands of a wealthy tyrant who had purchased a young bride to serve as an ornamental trophy. We arrived at Sterling Manor just as the last light of day bled out of the sky. It was a massive, historic stone estate, its dark windows gazing out over the turbulent ocean like tired eyes. The architecture was heavy, anchored by ancient granite and wrought iron, completely devoid of the ostentatious, modern glass and steel luxury I had anticipated. We stepped into the grand foyer, where the air was thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and the lingering smoke of a distant hearth. The CEO finally paused, turning to face me beneath a towering chandelier that remained unlit. The shadows carved deep lines into his face, emphasizing the age gap between us, but also highlighting the profound weariness in his posture. He reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a set of heavy brass keys, placing them gently onto the polished entryway table between us. They clinked against the dark mahogany, the sound echoing sharply in the cavernous hall. Your father believed he was selling you, Clara, Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the quiet air. But I did not buy a possession. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat as he stepped back, deliberately maintaining a physical distance. You will have your own bedroom, in the East Wing, he continued, his tone clinical but incredibly gentle. You will have your own library, your own schedule, and your own privacy. I cleared your father's debts because I required an intellectual companion, a brilliant mind to manage something my family has left neglected for a century. Not a submissive wife, not a prisoner. He did not wait for my gratitude. He did not wait for my tears of relief. The older man simply gave a brief, formal nod and walked away down the long corridor, leaving me standing alone in the shadows. The tension that had been coiled in my spine for months suddenly fractured. Not because he had demanded anything of me, but because he hadn't. I reached out, my trembling fingers grazing the cold metal of the heavy brass keys. In a world that had constantly treated me as collateral, this stoic, untouchable figure had just handed me back my autonomy. I picked up the keys, their weight grounding me in the present moment, and for the first time in years I felt safe enough to breathe. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron. I was introduced to Thomas Miller, the estate's head of household, a quiet, meticulously dignified man who spoke in hushed tones and moved as though he were trying not to disturb the dust. The loyal butler guided me through the labyrinth of the manor, pointing out the dining hall, the solarium, and finally, the heart of my new husband's world. When he pushed open the heavy oak doors, the scent of decaying paper, dry leather, and deep cedarwood washed over me. It was a massive 2-story archival library, lined with towering bookshelves that stretched up toward a vaulted ceiling. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light filtering through the tall, arched windows. Julian was already there, standing by a massive oak desk, his hands resting flat against a large, open box of documents. "This is why you are here," Julian said, looking up as I entered the vast room. He gestured to the fragile yellowed papers spilling from the crate. My family's 19th century shipping and mining archives. Decades of correspondence, financial ledgers, and operational diaries that have never been properly cataloged or translated from their original, coded shorthand. I stepped closer, my professional instincts immediately overriding my lingering guardedness. I was a trained archivist and translator, a scholar of historical syntax, and seeing the delicate, crumbling pages ignited a quiet spark of purpose in my chest. This was not busy work invented to keep a restless bride occupied. This was a monumental intellectual undertaking, a complex puzzle that required absolute precision. The stoic executive reached into the box and carefully extracted the ancestral mining ledger, a thick, leather-bound volume. The cover was cracked, the binding hanging by a few fraying threads. He placed it gently on the center of the desk, treating it with a strange mixture of reverence and deep caution. "I need someone with your specific academic background to restore and translate these records," he explained, his gray eyes meeting mine. "But more importantly, I need someone I can trust. The history of Sterling Green Energy is rooted in these pages. I want to know exactly what kind of foundation my ancestors built." I traced the embossed lettering on the thick volume's spine, feeling the dry, rough texture of the ancient leather against my fingertips. I nodded, a silent agreement passing between us. He was offering me a sanctuary built of words and history, a place where my mind was valued above my compliance. Over the next month, the massive archival library became my entire world, and the manor settled into a rhythm of silent domesticity. My days were spent hunched over the heavy oak desk, a magnifying glass in one hand and a fountain pen in the other, slowly deciphering the elegant, looping cursive of men who had been dead for over 100 years. I cataloged manifests, transcribed shipping routes, and meticulously mapped out the archaic accounting systems of the ancestral mining operations. The work was exhausting, demanding a level of focus that left my eyes burning and my shoulders aching by nightfall, but it was profoundly fulfilling. I was no longer a debt payment. I was a professional, trusted with the weight of a dynasty's forgotten legacy. Julian rarely interrupted me during the daylight hours, honoring the boundary he had established on my first night. He managed his sprawling green energy empire from a separate wing of the estate, dealing with the conservative board members and international supply chains, shouldering the massive weight of a modern corporation. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the coastal winds began to howl against the stone walls, our separate lives would quietly converge. Every evening at 8 o'clock, my husband would enter the library. He never announced his arrival. I would simply notice the faint scent of cedarwood, cutting through the smell of old paper, and I would look up to see him taking a seat in a deep leather armchair by the massive stone fireplace. He would bring a file of his own work or a heavy novel, and we would sit in the same room for hours, surrounded by absolute silence. It was a silence that carried no expectations, no hidden traps, and no demands. It was a space where I did not have to perform, defend myself, or justify my existence. But it was in this quiet sanctuary that I began to notice the minute details of his quiet protection. One evening, a harsh coastal draft slipped through the poorly sealed window panes, cutting across the room and chilling the back of my neck. I shivered, pulling my wool cardigan tighter around my shoulders, intent on ignoring the cold to finish translating a particularly difficult passage of the archaic logbook. I heard the scrape of a chair against the floorboards. Julian stood up, walked over to the hearth, and gripped the heavy brass hearth screen. Without a word, he lifted the massive iron and brass structure, carrying it across the room to position it perfectly between my desk and the drafty window, shielding me from the bitter wind. He did not ask if I was cold. He did not point out his chivalry. The powerful man simply adjusted the physical environment to ensure my comfort, then returned to his armchair and opened his book as if nothing had happened. I stared at the intricate brass screen, my throat tightening with a sudden, overwhelming ache. I was used to men like my father, men who demanded endless gratitude for the absolute bare minimum, men who kept score of every forced favor. Julian kept no score. His care was entirely practical, deeply observant, and aggressively silent. I looked down at my ink-smudged fingers, realizing that my defensive walls, the emotional armor I had spent years building against a transactional world, were completely useless against a man who asked for nothing in return. I could not match his fortune, and I could not alleviate the massive corporate burdens he carried, but I could speak his language of silent service. The next evening, when the antique grandfather clock chimed 8, and the CEO walked into the library, he did not find an empty side table next to his armchair. Instead, resting on a small slate coaster, sat a delicate, warm chamomile teacup. I had watched him enough to know he preferred it steeped for exactly 4 minutes with no honey, leaving the brew warm and slightly bitter. I kept my head bowed over the open, fragile pages, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for his reaction. I heard his footsteps pause. I heard the soft clink of ceramic against stone as he picked up the mug. I did not look up, but I heard a long, quiet exhale. The sound of a man who had carried the weight of the world alone for too long, finally allowing himself to set it down, even if just for a moment. The days bled into one another, measured not by the passage of the sun, but by the slow, meticulous turning of brittle pages. The massive archival library of the estate became my cocoon of hushed isolation, smelling eternally of dry leather, decaying vellum, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of iron gall ink. My routine settled into a quiet, monastic rhythm. Every morning, after a silent breakfast, alone in the dining hall, I would take my place behind the heavy oak desk. I arranged my tools with surgical precision. A brass-rimmed magnifying glass, a row of sharpened graphite pencils, a fresh notebook, and the formidable historical tome, resting dead center on a protective felt mat. I was no longer Clara Vance, the desperate daughter traded away to erase a mountain of reckless debt. In this room, surrounded by towering shelves of forgotten history, I was an architect of the past, tasked with rebuilding a fractured dynasty one word at a time. The ledger was a formidable artifact, demanding complete intellectual surrender. Its cracked binding flakes left dark, powdery residue on my fingertips, and the pages were stiff with age, threatening to crumble if turned too quickly. For the first 2 weeks, the translation work was straightforward, if tedious. I deciphered mundane logistical records, the cost of raw iron, shipping manifests for coal, and the daily wages of dockworkers in the late 19th century. The ancestors of Julian Sterling had built their fortune on a foundation of obsessive accounting, recording every fraction of a penny spent on industrial expansion. But as I worked my way into the middle third of the massive volume, the rhythm of the original author's handwriting began to subtly shift. The elegant, flowing cursive of the early pages grew cramped, hurried, and sharply angled. The standard financial columns gave way to dense, unbroken paragraphs of text squeezed tightly into the margins. And then, buried beneath a seemingly innocuous inventory of coastal mining equipment, I found them. They were letters, or rather, the exact transcriptions of outgoing private correspondence, copied directly into the ledger to hide in plain sight. I adjusted my magnifying glass, squinting through the distortion of the curved lens as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the floorboards. At first glance, the text appeared to be a chaotic jumble of random consonants and erratic numbers, completely devoid of vowels or standard grammatical syntax. A cold, electric thrill of professional recognition shot down my spine. This was not a deterioration of the clerk's penmanship due to age or fatigue. It was a cipher. Specifically, it was a highly complex, hybridized mercantile shorthand, a rare cryptographic method used by 19th century industrialists to conceal transactions and off-the-books communications from government inspectors. It was a language designed explicitly to hide sins. I sat back in my chair, the heavy silence of the library suddenly feeling oppressive, as if the towering bookshelves were leaning inward to watch me. Why would the founding patriarch of a legitimate shipping empire need to encode his private correspondence within a standard financial log? The tension in the room did not come from a sudden noise, a raised voice, or a physical threat. It came purely from the dusty, tactile reality of the old paper resting under my hands. I leaned forward again, gripping the brass handle of the magnifying glass so tightly, my knuckles turned white against my skin. I began the grueling process of breaking the cipher, sketching out a complex translation matrix in my notebook. Hours evaporated into the quiet air. The pale light filtering through the tall arched windows slowly shifted to the bruised purple of dusk. But I did not stop. I crossed out false cognates, traced the repetitive loops of the hidden letters, and slowly coaxed the dead century into giving up its darkest secrets. As I worked, translating letter by agonizing letter, I noticed a peculiar physical detail on the edge of the ledger's heavy pages. Dark, perfectly oval smudges stained the bottom corners of the paper. The permanent, localized marks of the original clerk's ink-stained thumbs pressed deeply into the fibers. As he held the book steady to write his encoded lies, without thinking, I reached out. I pressed my own left hand flat against the open page. My ink-smudged thumb aligned flawlessly, perfectly overlapping the dark stain left by the man who had sat in a room much like this one, over 100 years ago. A ghost of a shudder worked its way through my chest, chilling the blood in my veins. The human reality of the moment was completely paralyzing. That long-dead clerk had just been an instrument, a paid hand ordered to execute the quiet, dirty work of a powerful man, leaving nothing behind but the grease of his skin and the ink on his fingers. I stared at my own hand, tracing the exact same shape on the brittle paper. I had been purchased to do a job. I was a tool, acquired through a legal arrangement, meant to quietly process the historical liabilities of a billionaire. We were both just hands in the dark, performing labor for a dynasty that would never remember our names. But as the first full sentences of the decoded cipher began to form in my notebook, a creeping, freezing dread began to replace my academic detachment. The clerk had been hiding a crime, and I was in the process of dragging it out of the shadows. It took 3 agonizing days to fully translate the sequence of coded letters, each decrypted sentence tightening an invisible vice around my ribs. The truth was not a simple financial discrepancy or a minor tax evasion. It was a systemic, calculated atrocity. According to the decrypted correspondence, the founding ancestors of the corporate empire had not purchased the vast tracts of coastal land that served as the foundation of their early wealth. They had stolen it. The letters detailed a methodical, ruthless campaign of exploitation against a local, marginalized coastal community. The ancestors had deliberately poisoned the community's primary freshwater source with toxic mining runoff, rendering the land uninhabitable. and forcing the desperate, sickened residents to sell their ancestral homes for fractions of a penny. The ruined lives, the illnesses, and the forced displacement were recorded, not with an ounce of remorse, but with clinical precision, logged in the margins as acceptable depreciations of local capital. I stared down at my notebook, my breathing shallow and fast, feeling as though the air had been entirely sucked out of the vast room. The sheer scale of the historical cruelty made my stomach turn. But the modern implications were far more terrifying. My husband had spent his entire career pivoting his family's dark industrial past into a globally recognized green energy empire. His company's multi-billion-dollar valuation was completely anchored by its pristine, aggressive commitment to ethical environmental practices and community restoration. This dew-coated document was not just a piece of history. It was a live bomb. If these letters were ever leaked to the press or to his ruthless corporate rivals, it would instantly dismantle his modern ethical platform. The sheer hypocrisy of the ancestral actions would shatter the company's stock, destroy his legacy, and ruin the man himself. I carefully closed the ancient volume, the dull thud of the heavy leather cover echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. My hands were trembling so violently, I could barely control them. I pressed my palms flat against the cold mahogany of the desk, leaning my weight onto my wrists, trying to force the physical panic out of my nervous system. I was trapped. I had been hired to find the truth, but the truth was fatal. Did the older man know? Did the stoic CEO, who had cleared Arthur Vance's debts, know that his massive fortune was built on a graveyard of stolen land? The thought made my chest ache with a sudden, sharp betrayal. If he knew, then I was simply a pawn, brought here to secretly locate and destroy the evidence before anyone else could. But if he didn't know, if he was truly innocent of his ancestors' sins, then I was currently holding the very instrument of his utter destruction. The heavy, rhythmic chiming of the antique grandfather clock shattered my spiraling thoughts. It was 8 o'clock. The evening shadows had fully consumed the library, leaving only the warm, isolated pool of illumination from my brass desk lamp. Right on cue, I heard the faint familiar creak of the heavy oak doors opening at the far end of the room. The scent of old paper and dust was immediately pierced by the sharp, clean aroma of cedarwood and cold evening rain. I did not turn around. I could not let him see my face. I heard his slow, measured footsteps crossing the wooden floorboards, moving toward his usual leather armchair by the massive stone fireplace. My heart hammered frantically against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. The quiet domestic routine we had established demanded my participation. I had to perform the ritual, or my sudden deviation would immediately signal that something was profoundly wrong. Moving with stiff, mechanical precision, I stood up and walked over to the small antique cart where the household staff always left the evening supplies. My hands shook as I poured the hot water over the dried flowers, watching the liquid turn a pale, golden yellow. I prepared the chamomile teacup exactly as I always did. A 4-minute steep, no honey, leaving the brew warm and intentionally bitter. Every second felt like an eternity. I was hyper-aware of the space between us, analyzing the quiet distance, wondering if the man sitting by the fire was my silent protector, or a ruthless monster wearing a tailored suit. I carried the ceramic mug across the room, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the intricate patterns of the rug beneath my feet. I reached his side table and set the coaster down, my knuckles stark white as I gripped the handle of the cup, before finally forcing my fingers to release it. The ceramic clinked softly against the slate. I took a step back, ready to retreat to my desk, to hide behind the safety of the heavy shadows and the towering stacks of books. But before I could turn away, he spoke. "You are trembling." His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the quiet air. It was not a threat, not a demand, just a quiet, incredibly observant statement of fact that paralyzed me completely. I froze in place, my breath hitching painfully in my throat. I looked down at my hands, which were still hovering slightly above the table, shaking with a fine, uncontrollable tremor. I quickly pulled them back, burying them deep in the pockets of my wool cardigan, my mind racing to construct a plausible lie to explain my terror. "It is just the cold," I whispered, my voice sounding thin, fragile, and utterly unconvincing in the cavernous room. The draft from the northern windows is stronger tonight. I finally looked up, forcing myself to meet his pale, striking gray eyes. The shadows cast by the flickering hearth fire carved deep, exhausted lines into his face, highlighting the silver at his temples. He looked at me with an intensity that made me want to shrink backward, his gaze sweeping over my pale face, the dark circles under my eyes, and my unnaturally rigid posture. He did not look angry. He did not look suspicious. He looked profoundly sad. Our existence did not rush. It lingered in this quiet room, between the unfinished words of a dead century, in the heavy spaces where trust was being built, without a single spoken vow on Io. I braced myself for the interrogation, terrified that he would demand to see my translation notes, terrified that he would see the ruin of his empire written across my terrified face. Instead, the powerful executive slowly reached out and picked up the warm ceramic mug. He held it in his large, capable hands, letting the heat seep into his skin, his eyes never leaving mine. "You are pushing yourself too hard," he said quietly, his tone softening into something that sounded dangerously close to genuine, unprotected affection. "You have not left that desk in 3 days. The archives have waited 100 years to be read. They can wait one more night." He was giving me an out. He was completely misinterpreting my moral agony for standard scholarly fatigue. The tragic, bitter irony of the moment washed over me, heavy and suffocating. This stoic, formidable man, a tycoon who ruthlessly managed global supply chains and dominated hostile boardrooms, was sitting quietly by a fire, gently worrying about my physical exhaustion, completely unaware that I was standing 10 feet away from a document that could end his life's work. Or worse, he was completely aware, and this soft, tender domesticity was just another layer of the transaction, a calculated manipulation to ensure my ultimate silence. "I want you to stop working for the evening," he continued, his voice firm but undeniably gentle, carrying the weight of a man who only knew how to protect through command. "Sit by the fire, drink your tea. The past is heavy enough without you trying to carry all of it on your own shoulders. Not a tyrant, not a jailer, just a man asking his wife to rest." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me entirely. I gave a small, jerky nod, unable to force another lie past my lips, terrified that if I spoke, I would shatter the delicate illusion of our peace. I turned away from the warmth of the hearth and walked slowly back to the massive oak desk. I did not sit down. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cracked leather cover of the cursed ledger. With slow, deliberate movements, I picked up the heavy book, along with my notebook full of the decrypted, damning truth. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk, placed the documents inside, and turned the small brass key until the lock clicked shut with a sharp, definitive snap. I slipped the key into my pocket, feeling the cold metal press against my thigh like a physical brand. I had hidden the sin. But as I walked back toward the fireplace to take my seat in the silent room, the emotional distance between us felt vast, unnavigable, and infinitely dangerous. I was no longer just a brilliant mind hired to catalog the past. I was the secret keeper of his imminent ruin, and as I sat in the leather chair opposite him, staring into the flames, I had absolutely no idea how long I could carry the crushing weight of his destruction in the dark. The next 3 days were swallowed by a relentless, punishing coastal storm that battered the heavy stone architecture of Sterling Manor. The violent New England rain lashed against the tall, arched windows of the archival library, turning the glass into sheets of gray, distorted ice. I sat behind the massive oak desk, entirely consumed by the crushing weight of the secret locked in the bottom drawer. The air in the cavernous room felt suffocating, thick with the scent of decaying paper and the metallic tang of my own anxiety. I tried to focus on cataloging a series of mundane shipping manifests, attempting to force my trembling hands into the familiar, methodical rhythm of my profession. But the psychological distance between myself and the rest of the world felt unbridgeable. I was no longer a simple archivist, and I was certainly not just a debt payment. I was the lone guardian of a truth that could dismantle a multi-billion-dollar green energy empire. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock was abruptly severed by the sharp creak of the library's massive double doors, swinging inward. I looked up, my spine instantly stiffening. Thomas Miller stood in the threshold, his normally impassive, dignified features drawn tight with a subtle, unmistakable tension. The loyal butler did not step into the room. He merely held the door open, his posture rigidly formal as he blocked the entrance. "Madam," the older man said, his voice clipped and unnaturally flat, "I apologize for the intrusion. A Mr. Reginald Thorne has arrived from the city. He insists that his business regarding the estate's historical assets cannot wait for Mr. Sterling's return." Before I could respond, a figure pushed past the butler, stepping into the quiet sanctuary of the library with the arrogant, unhurried stride of a man accustomed to owning whatever floor he walked upon. The ambitious executive was a study in predatory corporate polish. Reginald wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored suit that looked entirely out of place against the ancient mahogany and dust of my husband's world. He carried a slack black leather portfolio under his arm, and his cologne, a harsh synthetic blend of citrus and spice, immediately clashed with the comforting heavy scent of old wood and beeswax. I set my graphite pencil down on the felt mat, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. I did not stand up. I weaponized the stillness I had learned from Julian, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy and uncomfortable. "Mrs. Sterling," the intruder said, his lips curling into a smile that did not reach his calculating, predatory eyes. "Or should I say, Miss Vance? I hear the ink on the marriage arrangement is barely dry. I apologize for the unannounced visit, but corporate synergy waits for no one, not even newlyweds." "Mr. Thorne," I replied, my voice dropping into a calm, emotionless register. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, my right index finger resting lightly against the fabric of my pocket, feeling the cold, hard outline of the small brass desk key hidden within. "My husband is currently in the city. If you require his signature, you have come to the wrong wing of the estate." Reginald let out a soft, patronizing chuckle, stepping deeper into the room. His eyes roamed the towering bookshelves, like a man pricing timber for slaughter. "Julian is a brilliant strategist, but he is fundamentally sentimental. The board of directors, however, is not. We are currently preparing for a massive public offering of our new coastal wind initiatives. This little pet project of his, this sudden desire to dig up the 19th century operational ledgers, is a catastrophic liability." He reached the edge of my desk, dropping his heavy portfolio onto the polished wood with a loud, jarring slap. "I am here to conduct a preliminary risk assessment. I need to see the primary operational logs immediately. We cannot afford for a novice archivist to accidentally unearth something that might complicate our environmental narrative." I analyzed the man standing across from me, breaking down his anatomy of intimidation. He leaned forward, attempting to use his physical height and his tailored authority to shrink me into submission. I had spent my entire life dealing with loan sharks, aggressive creditors, and desperate men who demanded my father's money with raised voices and clenched fists. Reginald was exactly the same breed of parasite. He simply wore a better watch and used longer words. The realization did not bring panic. It brought a sudden crystalline clarity. I was no longer the frightened girl sitting in a sterile registry office. I was the lady of this estate, and I was the absolute authority in this room. "You are gravely mistaken regarding your jurisdiction here," I said, my tone remaining impossibly level, refusing to match his aggressive energy. "This library, and everything contained within it, is the private intellectual property of the Sterling estate. These documents are fragile, uncatalogued historical antiquities. I am a senior executive of Sterling Green Energy," the man interrupted, his smile vanishing, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "I don't care about the dust on the paper. I care about what is written on it. Open the drawers, Clara. Let's not make this difficult. You were brought here to clear a debt, not to play corporate gatekeeper." I did not flinch at the deliberate insult. I simply looked at him, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. "Until my academic cataloging is complete, and a formal transfer of information is authorized by the estate owner, these artifacts are protected under federal archival copyright laws. Furthermore, any forceful handling of these 19th century bindings, without my express, documented permission, constitutes a destruction of private heritage property." I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, letting the sheer weight of my institutional knowledge form an impenetrable wall between us. You have no legal right to demand a single page from me, Mr. Thorne. You have no authority in this house. And if you ever speak to me with that tone again, I will not wait for my husband to return to address it. I will simply have Thomas contact the local authorities and have you removed for trespassing." The silence had teeth. The executive stared at me, his jaw clenching so tightly I could see a muscle jumping beneath his skin. He had expected a timid, easily bullied young bride who would crumble under corporate pressure. Instead, he had collided with a wall of academic iron. He realized with a flicker of genuine frustration in his eyes that he had absolutely no leverage. He could not physically force me to open the desk without risking a massive legal scandal, and he could not out-argue the rigid boundaries of my profession. Without another word, Reginald snatched his leather portfolio off the desk. He turned sharply on his heel, his expensive shoes echoing aggressively against the floorboards as he marched out of the room. Thomas stepped out of the shadows, shutting the heavy oak doors firmly behind him. With a deeply satisfying, resonant thud, I remained perfectly still for 10 long seconds. Only when I was absolutely certain I was alone did I allow my lungs to expand, drawing in a ragged, shaking breath. My hands, which had been so steady while Reginald was in the room, suddenly began to tremble violently. I pulled the desk key from my pocket, the metal biting sharply into my palm. The corporate sharks were circling. They suspected the rot in the foundation, and they were actively hunting for the exact documents I was currently hiding. The crushing weight of the situation descended upon me, heavy and absolute. I could not keep the ancient book locked away forever. The secret was toxic, and it was beginning to poison the quiet sanctuary I had fought so hard to build. The grueling afternoon slowly bled into a dark, unforgiving evening. The rain continued to assault the glass, isolating the manor from the rest of the world. I did not leave the library. I sat in the dim light of the brass desk lamp, staring at the polished wood of the bottom drawer. The moral pressure was suffocating. I was a professional historian. My entire life was dedicated to the preservation and exposure of the truth. But if I exposed this truth, I would completely destroy the stoic, quiet man who had handed me back my dignity. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind howling against the stone walls, feeling completely unmoored in a sea of impossible choices. At exactly 8 o'clock, the antique grandfather clock chimed, its deep, resonant notes vibrating through the floorboards. A moment later, the heavy oak doors opened. I did not need to look up to know who had returned. The scent of cedarwood, cold rain, and clean linen instantly cut through the stale air of the library. Julian walked into the room, his heavy charcoal overcoat damp from the storm. He looked profoundly exhausted, the silver at his temples catching the dim light, the deep lines around his eyes, speaking of endless, hostile board meetings and the crushing burden of his empire. He did not walk toward his usual leather armchair by the massive stone fireplace. Instead, his pale, striking gray eyes locked onto me, immediately registering the unnatural rigidity of my posture and the pale, drawn exhaustion on my face. He crossed the room slowly, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space, until he stood on the opposite side of the heavy oak desk. He looked down. I had unlocked the drawer. Resting in the center of the protective felt mat was the ancestral mining ledger, its cracked leather cover open to the exact page of the coded letters. Placed directly beside it, perfectly aligned, was my handwritten, decoded, decrypted translation notes. I had laid the sin bare, the physical evidence of his family's historical atrocity, the systemic poisoning of a local water source, the ruthless theft of marginalized land, sat between us like a loaded weapon. My heart hammered frantically against my ribs, a wild, terrified rhythm. I waited for the anger. I waited for the cold, calculating tycoon to emerge, for the man who would tear up my notes and demand my eternal silence to protect his fortune. "Reginald came here today," Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried no accusation, only a heavy, weary resignation. It was not a question. "He wanted the ledgers," I whispered, my voice trembling, despite my desperate attempts to keep it steady. "He said your environmental platform was a liability. He wanted to ensure I hadn't found anything." I slowly pushed the decrypted translation notes across the polished wood, my ink-smudged fingers lingering on the edge of the paper. "But I did find it, Julian. The cipher. The letters. Your ancestors didn't build this empire. They stole the land. They poisoned the water. It's all here. Every single terrible detail. I braced myself, my defensive walls snapping into place, preparing for the inevitable betrayal. But the older man did not shout. He did not reach for the papers to destroy them. Instead, Julian closed his eyes, and a long, ragged exhale escaped his lips. The tension that had held his broad shoulders rigidly in place for weeks suddenly collapsed. He did not look like a billionaire facing the destruction of his legacy. He looked like a man who had been carrying a corpse on his back for a decade, finally allowed to set it down. He walked slowly around the edge of the massive desk, stepping into my physical space. He leaned back against the edge of the mahogany, crossing his arms, looking down at the ancient cursed book with a mixture of profound disgust and overwhelming relief. "I knew the foundation was rotten, Clara," he said quietly, his voice vibrating with a quiet, devastating honesty. "I didn't have the exact mechanism of the crime. I couldn't read the shorthand, but I saw the gaps in the property deeds. I saw the sudden, inexplicable mass exodus of that coastal community a century ago. I knew my family had buried a monster." He turned his head, his pale gray eyes fixing on my face with an intensity that made the breath catch in my throat. "The board of directors suspected it too. For years, they have pressured me to quietly incinerate this entire wing of the estate, to burn the archives and erase the risk entirely." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the absolute subversion of my fears. "Then why did you bring me here?" I asked, my voice barely a breath. "If you knew the documents were dangerous, why did you hire an archivist to translate them? You paid off my father's massive debts just to put a magnifying glass over your own ruin." "Because I refused to build my future on a graveyard," Julian replied, his tone hardening with a quiet, unyielding, fierce conviction. "The corporate lawyers would have buried it. The board executives like Reginald would have burned it. I needed an independent mind. I needed someone entirely untethered to my wealth. Someone who understood what it meant to be crushed by the sins of a father." He stepped closer, the warmth of his presence cutting through the bitter chill of the library. "I reviewed your academic background before I ever saw your father's promissory notes. I chose you, Clara, not to be a quiet, compliant wife. I chose you because I knew your uncompromising integrity would force my hand. I needed someone who would not flinch when they found the truth. The absolute, blinding reality of his silent devotion washed over me, completely shattering the last remnants of the defensive armor I had worn since my graduation day. He had not purchased a secret keeper. He had authorized his own reckoning, using my brilliant mind as the instrument of his ethical salvation. "If we present this translation to the board," I whispered, tears suddenly burning the corners of my eyes, "they will tear you apart, Julian. The stock will plummet. The press will dismantle your legacy. You will lose everything you have built. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the desk. He reached out with his large, capable hand and picked up my silver fountain pen, the exact same pen he had offered me on the day we signed the marriage contract. He looked at the cold metal for a long moment, the flickering light of the desk lamp reflecting off the silver barrel. Then, moving with a gentle, deliberate reverence, the powerful CEO stepped to my side. He reached down and took my trembling right hand. He did not grasp it with force. He simply held it, his thumb lightly tracing the ink smudges on my knuckles. Slowly, he placed the silver fountain pen back into my palm. He did not let go. Instead, he rested his large, warm fingers over mine, physically guiding my hand to rest on top of the damning, decrypted translation notes. He was surrendering his empire. He was placing the entire weight of his fortune, his reputation, and his legacy directly into my hands, trusting my judgment implicitly. "Write the life you want," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a raw, unprotected emotion, his eyes completely stripped of their stoic shields. "I'll meet you there." 72 hours later, the heavy, comforting scent of old wood and beeswax was replaced by the sterile, manufactured chill of the city. We stood inside the glass-walled elevator of the Sterling Green Energy headquarters, ascending rapidly toward the 60th floor. The air inside the steel box tasted of ozone, expensive cologne, and the sharp, metallic tang of corporate anxiety. I wore a simple, structured wool coat, holding my leather satchel tightly against my chest. Inside it rested the original century-old records, the decrypted translation notes, and a newly drafted 50-page document that we had spent the last 3 nights constructing together. The restitution proposal. I kept my eyes fixed on the changing numbers above the doors, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I had never belonged in this world of towering glass and ruthless efficiency. I was an archivist, a quiet woman accustomed to the company of the dead, recently purchased to erase a desperate man's financial ruin. But as the elevator slowed, I felt a large, warm hand rest gently against the small of my back. I looked up. My husband did not offer a hollow smile or a loud declaration of confidence. He simply met my gaze, his pale, striking gray eyes radiating an absolute, unyielding calm. He was about to walk into a room and willingly dismantle the empire he had spent his entire adult life building, and he looked more at peace than I had ever seen him. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling, sunlit boardroom that felt more like a surgical theater than a place of business. A massive slab of frosted glass served as the conference table, surrounded by a dozen executives who represented the apex of corporate power. At the head of the table sat Sibylla DuPont, the senior board member, whose conservative influence had dominated the company for decades. She wore a severe tailored suit, her posture rigidly demanding compliance, her eyes narrowing as we crossed the threshold. Reginald Thorne sat a few chairs down, his smug confidence from the estate library replaced by a tense, nervous energy. He refused to look at me, staring intently at his tablet. Julian pulled out a chair for me near the center of the long table. He did not take his usual place at the head of the room. Instead, he took the seat immediately to my left, deliberately positioning us as absolute equals, in a space designed entirely around hierarchy. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, and dripping with unspoken judgment. To these people, I was an anomaly. I was the debt bride, the naive, silent transaction, who was supposed to remain hidden in the coastal estate, serving as a quiet, ornamental alibi for their CEO. Julian, Sibylla began, her voice a sharp, cultured instrument designed to cut through dissent. She did not acknowledge my presence. We were expecting a standard quarterly review this morning. Reginald informed us that you have ordered a complete halt on the Coastal Wind Initiative. I trust there is a highly logical, profitable explanation for freezing a multi-billion-dollar public offering. My husband did not speak. He leaned back slightly in his leather chair and turned his head, giving me a single, almost imperceptible nod. My hands trembled as I unbuckled the straps of my satchel. I reached inside and pulled out the heavy, cracked volume of the historical archives. I set the ancestral mining ledger down on the pristine frosted glass. The dull, heavy thud echoed sharply in the sterile room, leaving a faint dusting of century-old leather flakes on the immaculate surface. Beside it, I placed the decrypted translation notes. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, entirely professional, wrapping myself in the armor of my academic discipline. "The Coastal Wind Initiative cannot proceed, Ms. DuPont," I said, my voice starting out thin, but quickly finding its anchor in the absolute certainty of the truth. I looked directly into the older woman's eyes, refusing to shrink under her hostile glare. Because the land slated for the development does not legally or ethically belong to this corporation. Sibylla let out a short, venomous laugh, finally turning her gaze toward me. And who authorized the archivist to dictate corporate strategy? "Julian, this is a board meeting, not a historical society show and tell. Remove her so we can conduct actual business." "She stays," Julian stated, his gravelly baritone cutting through the room with the force of a falling blade. He did not raise his voice, but the sheer, crushing weight of his authority instantly silenced the murmurs of the surrounding executives. "You will listen to every word my wife has to say. Proceed, Clara." I took a slow, steadying breath. I opened the decrypted translation notes, my ink-smudged fingers tracing the complex cipher matrices I had built in the quiet isolation of the manor. For the next 20 minutes, I laid the sins of a dynasty bare. I walked the board through the exact methodology of the mercantile shorthand, reading the decoded correspondence word for word. I detailed the systematic poisoning of the freshwater aquifers a century ago. I explained the calculated, ruthless displacement of the marginalized coastal community, the deliberate engineering of a localized health crisis, and the subsequent theft of the land that currently served as the bedrock of their green energy valuation. I did not speak with melodrama or tearful outrage. I spoke with clinical, devastating academic precision, leaving them absolutely no room for denial, misinterpretation, or corporate spin. When I finally finished, the silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the terrified, hollow quiet of a room full of powerful people realizing that the foundation beneath their feet had just turned to ash. Reginald was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Sibylla, however, did not look frightened. She looked furious. She leaned forward, placing her manicured hands flat against the glass table, her eyes darting from the decaying ledger to the stoic executive sitting beside me. "This is ancient history," the senior board member hissed, dropping the veneer of corporate politeness entirely. "A century-old diary entry, written in some obsolete code. It holds zero legal liability today unless you are foolish enough to create a panic. We will simply seal the archive. We bury it as we have always done. We proceed with the public offering, and we protect the stock." I reached into my satchel one final time and withdrew the thick, bound stack of paper that contained our future. I slid the restitution proposal across the glass until it rested directly in front of her. "We are not sealing the archive," I replied, my voice remarkably steady. "The proposal before you outlines the immediate, irrevocable transfer of the contested coastal territories to a newly established community trust. Furthermore, it details the liquidation of a majority of the Sterling personal shares to fund the necessary environmental purification of the original aquifers." Sibylla stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. She looked up, her expression twisting into a mask of pure, undisguised contempt. She bypassed me entirely, targeting the man she believed she could control through the threat of financial ruin. "You are out of your mind, Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You are letting a purchased bride dictate the destruction of a multi-billion-dollar dynasty. If you force this through, you will be ruined. We will strip you of your title before the market opens tomorrow. The press will tear your legacy to shreds. You will walk out of this building with absolutely nothing." The threat hung in the sterile, filtered air, heavy and absolute. She was offering him a final chance to step back into the safety of his wealth, to silence me, and to remain the untouchable king of his empire. Julian did not shout back. He did not launch into a defense of his character, nor did he attempt to negotiate with the venomous executive. Instead, the older man simply shifted his weight. He slid his heavy leather chair exactly 1 inch closer to mine. Beneath the shadow of the frosted glass table, away from the predatory eyes of the board, he reached out. His large, warm fingers wrapped securely around my trembling hand, interlocking our fingers in a quiet, unbreakable grip. "I am not asking for your permission, Sibylla," Julian said, his voice stripped of all corporate pretense, leaving only the profound, exhausted relief of a man who had finally put down a burden he had carried his entire life. "I am informing you of my resignation, effective immediately. The documents have already been filed with the Federal Regulatory Commission. The historical ledger will be made public at noon. You can spend your energy fighting the inevitable, or you can spend it trying to salvage what is left of your own reputations. But my family is done building castles on stolen earth." He didn't wait for her screaming response. He didn't wait for Reginald to object. Julian stood up, his hand still holding mine, pulling me gently to my feet. He reached out with his free hand, picked up the heavy, damned book, and tucked it securely under his arm. Without a single backward glance, we walked out of the glass-walled boardroom, leaving the ruins of a toxic empire behind us. By the time the first heavy snow of December began to fall, the chaotic noise of the corporate world had faded into a distant, irrelevant memory. The transition had been brutal in the press, marked by plummeting stocks, vicious articles, and the rapid dismantling of the company's upper management. But inside the heavy stone walls of Sterling Manor, the air had never felt so clear. The estate was no longer a cold, isolated fortress guarding a dark secret. It was simply a home. The afternoon light was failing, painting the towering shelves of the archival library in soft, bruised shades of purple and gold. Outside, the wind howled against the arched windows, driving the snow in swirling, chaotic patterns, but the thick glass held the winter entirely at bay. The scent of decaying paper and dry leather was now mixed with the warm, comforting aroma of burning cedarwood and the faint herbal sweetness of dried lavender. I sat at the massive oak desk, my graphite pencil scratching softly against a fresh notebook. I was no longer deciphering the sins of the past. I was translating a collection of 19th century botanical journals, purely for the academic joy of the work. The heavy, oppressive anxiety that used to sit in my chest was completely gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering sense of safety. A quiet knock sounded, and the heavy double doors creaked open. Thomas Miller stepped into the room, carrying a brass bucket of fresh firewood. The loyal butler moved, with his usual dignified silence, but the rigid, formal tension that used to dictate his posture had softened considerably. He offered me a small, genuine smile as he walked toward the massive stone fireplace, setting the logs down with a soft clatter before quietly retreating back into the hallway, leaving us to our sanctuary. Julian sat in his leather armchair near the hearth. He wore a simple, heavy-knit sweater rather than a tailored suit, the silver at his temples catching the warm, flickering light of the fire. He was typing on a sleek silver laptop, finalizing the last legal transfers required to fully establish the community trust. He had surrendered his title, his immense corporate power, and the vast majority of his personal fortune, retaining only the estate and enough quiet investments to maintain our simple, isolated life. He was no longer the untouchable CEO of a global energy empire. He was just a man. I watched him from across the room, analyzing the physical changes in his posture, the rigid, defensive armor that had locked his broad shoulders in place since the day we met at the registry office was completely dissolved. He typed his final sentence, the rhythmic clicking of the keys coming to a sudden halt. He stared at the screen for a long, quiet moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Julian closed the laptop. The soft click of the metal casing snapping shut sounded incredibly final. It was the sound of a heavy door closing on a lifetime of inherited guilt. He did not immediately return to a book or look for another task. He stood up, stretching his back, and walked slowly over to the small antique cart resting near the edge of the bookshelves. Moving with the careful, practiced precision of a daily ritual, he poured hot water from the electric kettle over a delicate strainer of dried flowers. He waited in the silence, letting the steam rise into the cool air of the library. Sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits. It waits in the heavy silence of old rooms, in the spaces where trust is built through actions rather than empty promises. I had expected my marriage to be a lifelong cage, a sterile transaction to erase my father's reckless mistakes. I had expected to spend my life shrinking, hiding my intellect, and slowly fading into the shadows of a powerful man's world. Instead, the man who had bought my father's debts had willingly burned his own empire to the ground, simply to ensure that my voice was heard. Julian picked up the warm ceramic mug and walked across the wooden floorboards, his footsteps slow and even. He stopped beside my heavy oak desk and gently placed a chamomile teacup onto the slate coaster near my elbow. He had steeped it perfectly. 4 minutes, no honey, leaving the brew warm and intentionally bitter, exactly the way he knew I needed it. I set my graphite pencil down and looked up at him. The cold, impenetrable gray of his eyes had completely thawed, revealing a quiet, profound devotion that required no translation. He reached out, his large, warm fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from my forehead, his touch as light and careful as if he were handling one of the fragile antiquities in the archives. He didn't ask for gratitude. He didn't demand a grand declaration of my feelings. He simply stood beside me, an unwavering shield against a chaotic world, offering me the greatest luxury he possessed, his peaceful, silent presence. I leaned into his hand, closing my eyes as the warmth of his palm seeped into my skin. The storm raged outside the heavy stone walls, but inside this room, the long, bitter winter of our lives was finally over. We had lost the fortune, but we had saved our souls. And as the scent of chamomile and cedarwood wrapped around us in the dim light of the library, I finally understood the truth. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please take a moment to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know if you believe that the quietest acts of devotion are always the strongest. Until next time, find your peace and sit with us again.